Okay. So, hello everyone. Again, we are live with a new topic related to Web API, and I welcome you again for this particular topic of Web API security. Hello, my name is Rohit, working in Indian Cybersecurity Solution as a cybersecurity analyst. We do pen testing as well as the training part. So, let's get started with today's topic of Web API security. Let me present my screen. So I hope my screen is visible. So we'll get started with the topic of Web API, where we want to secure API application programming interface because that is the backbone of our model and interconnected application. So in this section, we'll try to find out the list of common vulnerabilities and some best practices on how do you keep your API ecosystem secure. So if we just go out to find out the importance of securing web APIs, that we already know that API is one of the fundamental most important part of a web application that transfer the request from application to the APIs, and then APIs it goes to the backend. So we need to keep that particular thing secure. For that, we have this type of common weaknesses. As we are talking about the common weaknesses and security loopholes in a web API, these are the very common weaknesses. You can see some injection flaw. Okay, for this security purpose, for the security of web API, we follow the standard of OAups in our organizations. And OAups will give us a list of top 10 web API security risks. And here are some common things, starting with the first one, the injection flaw, where we have different types of code, malicious code that we can inject in the API request from the front end, from the front of the API to the that will get executed in the backend, that will lead to some kind of data breaches and system compromise. In injection attack, we have many type of injection, like we have this SQL injection, we have XSS, different type of other code injections are there. After that, another important thing, another very common vulnerability is the broken authentication part. In this particular authentication means what? We try to authenticate ourselves to the APIs. We try to authenticate ourselves. We want to tell the APIs that we are the legitimate users. And in this particular flow, very simple or very common security flaw, that without being authenticated properly, we are able to get an access to the sensitive data in the backend, in the sensitive information of the application. We have excessive data exposure. In this particular session of web API security, we will be discussing about the common weaknesses. I will be discussing about the OAups top 10 standard, and at last I will tell you how do we test it by using Postman, by using Bob Suite, and somewhat of SQL map to test for SQL injection. And after that, we will be looking at a sample report on, I'll tell you a sample report, a bug bounty report. I'll show you how and where we got the bugs and how do you mitigate it. Okay, as a security professional, you should know how do you find the vulnerability. That is the mandatory part. Apart from that, the add-on point is what, like you need to find out the ways to mitigate the particular vulnerability. As I was talking about the common security vulnerabilities in web API, excessive data exposure is there, where API return excessive amount of data that is not necessary, and that excessive data can lead to some kind of information disclosure. Then we have this server misconfiguration. In the past live of mine, we talked about server misconfiguration, application misconfiguration, where we talked about the using older versions as well as password, or using the default password. In web part, we discussed about the directory traversal and file upload vulnerability. Again, we have this cross-site scripting attack also, very common. So talking about the APIs, we have these two types that uses two type of data format: the RESTful API, the REST API. Another is what we call as a SOAP API. In this RESTful API, we use different types of HTTP methods, like we have get method, post, put, delete. Basically, get it used to retrieve the data, post is used to manipulate, to put some data. That is what the use of post is. Okay, so when we use REST API, it is very useful, very what we can say, another term for it, like very easy for the users to use it. to use an web services that uses RESTful API, different HTTP methods if they use it, it will be very useful. So if I just go and show you something about the mechanism, before that, we will try to understand the OAuth's top 10 web API security risks. For that, I will show you in this particular slide. Okay. So the first we have the thing called as the BOLA, the broken object level authorization. Suppose a user has been granted some kind of privileges, we try to bypass that and get the information of some other users. So that is very common yet damaging API vulnerability. You can see here BOLA, the broken object level authorization. Okay, what are the common security issues? What are the risks associated with this security exposure? It can lead to data loss, it can lead to disclosure, it can lead to data manipulation. Here is an example and prevention of it. Like you can see the example, the attacker a user A who has been granted some kind of permission and some kind of what you say authenticated and got some permission authorization from that application, is able to retrieve the data of C and D, is what we call this BOLA, broken object level authentication, authorization. Talking about the prevention part, how do you prevent it? First of all, if you are getting some kind of authorization issues, you implement the access control properly. Here we have defined the data access policy, ensure that the authenticated data is authorized to request the data. So whatever we are requesting, we should be able to, as an authenticated user, we should be authorized to request that type of data. Talking about the second type of web API vulnerability, the OAuth's number two vulnerability is what we call as the broken authentication. As you know, authentication is something we try to give to the user and give to the server, and server will validate us whether we are the legitimate person or not. So in this broken authentication, okay, if there is a poorly implemented authentication that lets the user bypass the authentication mechanism. So this is the description of it, like poorly implemented security control, like poorly implemented controls leads to this broken authentication. Talking about the risks exposure here, okay, attacker can get an access to the user without being authorized, without being authenticated. We can easily steal the data, and unauthorized transaction can be possible. So what are the examples of it? Here are some examples of it. Like you can you can do brute forcing, you can do something called as credential stuffing. Okay, you can change the password and verify yourself also. So how do you prevent it? You properly define the authentication policies and follow the best practices. Talking about the best practices, we will be discussing it later in the PPT part. So if we talk about the third vulnerability of APIs, is this broken object property level authorization. Okay, so what does it mean? We exploit the endpoints. Okay, we try to exploit the endpoints, like type equals to premium, account type equals to premium. If we have account type equals to normal user, we try to change it, manipulate it to get the premium access of it, where we will be able to see the premium information like the email ID, like the name, like the what do you say, username and password of it. So in this particular topic of, in this particular example of broken object property level authorization, we try to exploit the endpoints by reading or manipulating the objects. Okay, that leads to excessive data exposure. This one is the main thing we try to avoid. Here we have some kind of example. How do you mitigate it? It can be only mitigated by limiting or permitting the fields with minimum amount of data. It it should, the application should return only the minimum amount of data. If we just scroll down, talking about number 4 of APIs, so we have something called as unrestricted resource consumption, the DOS come here, the denial of service come here. Any application that is taking unrestricted resource consumption will lead to some kind of denial of service attack or data harvesting. So here what happens, if we do not properly implement rate limiting or the processes who takes the lack of resources, so we can lead to a mass data retrieval, or it can lead to the operation interception, interruptions. So example of it, it can lead to a huge amount of traffic maximum allocable memory will be affected, maximum size upload file size will be done. How do you implement it? You filter out the traffic. Yeah, you implement traffic control mechanism in this particular OAuth top 10 number 4, that is unrestricted resource consumption. You try to implement this particular traffic control to prevent this vulnerability. If we talk about number 5 of the OAuth, talking about number 5 of OAuth, that is broken function level authorization. In this particular mod, in this particular OAuth top 10 broken in the top 5 of API security, broken function level authorization, what does it mean? Like we use the functionalities of API. Basically what we can do is like modify the data, we can create, delete the data. Okay, of whom? We can do the modification of our user, of myself, but if we are able to do something of some other user, that comes in this broken function level authorization. Suppose one user is having this power of editing, deleting and all, we are able to access those power of that user. That is what leads to this broken function level authorization. What are the risks associated with it? Obviously we are able to gain an access to other person functionality, like creating, updating and deleting the resources. So we are doing some kind of privilege escalation here, can lead to privilege escalation. It can lead to what? We'll get unauthorized access to endpoints. Okay, and it can lead to by that we will be able to get the broken function level authorization here, like modify the URL. The role is admin, account time is premium. You can delete it, deleting an invoice, setting the account balance to 0. How do you prevent this particular vulnerability? You try to identify the function that could lead to this critical or sensitive data exposure, and you try to limit the access on it. You try to limit the access on this broken level authorization. If I talk about the top 6, the sixth one, that is unrestricted access to the sensitive business flow. What does that mean? Like we will try to abuse the business flow through excessive or automated use, like rate limiting captcha not always effective against the fraudulent traffic. So what can this lead to? It will lead to the loss of security business activity. It can lead to the critical business activity, loss of that. And what happens? How do you prevent it? You can prevent it by stepping up some security mechanism for this automated testing, automated assessment. You can prevent it, or you can set it up some kind of what you say automated testing or control mechanism for it to detect any unnecessary traffic, and we try to avoid those unnecessary traffic. Talking about the seventh one, it also comes in number 10th of web security risks, the server side request forgery. So what happens in this server side request forgery? We are able to get an access to the inside server by the help of some public server. That is what basically the server side request forgery is. So what happens here? We try to exploit the URL. We try to exploit the URL here by making a request to the third party server. What happens after that? You can lead it leads to potential data leak. It leads to potential data leak. And what are the different examples of it? Yeah, last time we discussed, last live on web misconfiguration, we discussed about this LFI RFI, local file inclusion. Okay, something like directory traversal, we can say. So malware can be downloaded from malicious site into that particular internal server. How do you prevent it? Yeah, validate and sanitize all the user input. Whatever input we are giving, we should validate it. It should be validated properly. If I scroll down to the eighth one, this is the topic we discussed in the last live session. Again, talking about misconfiguration in the APIs and what could lead to misconfiguration. It can lead to excessive or sensitive data exposure. It can lead to full server compromise also. Okay, so some example, like if we have implemented security hardening, if there is a lack of security hardening, this could lead to a security misconfiguration. Missing TLS, cross origin resource sharing policy is missing. So these are the different examples of security misconfiguration that we have already seen in the life. Talking about the prevention part, implementing the hardening process is important. So implementing the hardening procedure is important in this security misconfiguration. We continuously check for any kind of, we continuously review the configuration that we have made. Okay, implement automated and continuous security testing we need to do. Talking about the ninth API security risks, what does it mean? Like improper inventory management, unauthorized API access via old and unused API version or through trusted third party can lead to obviously sensitive data exposure. Yeah, data and account theft we can do by the help of unretired API exposure of sensitive data. And example of it, like using older version of API, unpatched endpoints. Okay, talking about the prevention part of it. How do you prevent it? Like you implement some rules and processes for API versioning and retirement when it is getting old. If there is any kind of update, we need to update it properly. Okay, we implement strict policies for deployment of APIs. Talking about the last, that is unsafe consumption of APIs. What does this unsafe consumption of API mean? We try to, the exposure can occur via third-party APIs, which can generally lead to trusted. However, third-party API can be exploited, which can be used as used to attack the APIs, then rely on them. So basically, we try to access the third-party API. This leads to data exposure, account breach, account takeover. We inject, and what is the prevention of it? You implement proper security control for the third party API, validate, return, validate the data that is returned by the third party API, encrypt all the API communication. Okay, so if I just show you the mechanism we saw, input validation we were discussing, and we need to, yeah, this is the thing, we need to properly implement the security login and monitoring in APIs too. There's the thing. Okay, that can lead to crucial, that can lead to crucial monetary losses in different organization. You can see compromising the monitoring and login in API is a crucial for maintaining the security. So this is the graph of it, what losses it occurs. Mm. Talking about the best practices of API, we will be seeing that in the report. Some of them we have already seen. If you are using third party APIs, you can change it to, what do you say, you can update it, you properly validate the input. That is another thing. You give an access to an account with least privileges. You do regular auditing and update that particular API. So if I just talk about how do you test it, you can use some API handler like Postman. Okay, for this case we have used this vamp vamp pi, that is a vulnerable API. You can see here, this is the vulnerable API. Okay, this particular API, they create and populate the data. We have some retrieval of user by user information. Okay, to test API, very simple, you use any kind of API to handle like this Postman. Okay, and you send the request of the Postman to your burp suite. And how you are going to do it? You are going to do it by the help of the proxy. Go to settings, go to proxy settings here at the bottom, and you go to use the custom proxy configuration. There you set up the local host and the port number for it. I will close this one as I have already done it. So you can do different types of attack, just like in web only. You can do different types of attack here too. So here we have a post method is there. You can see we have to register for new user. Some successful registered login with a login to receive an authentication token. After logging in, we'll get an authentication token. So if I try to intercept the request, I'll click on switch on, and in this part, if I just it's a bit slow. So it is trying to make a post request as usual information. This is the post request. just like web only, now you can try different types of attack in this particular API. You can see this is a post method, right? You can right click on it, and if you are using a professional send scan, it will do the auditing easily. So it has already done it. What if I click and send it to active scan? Particular version, so no issues with it. So what I'll do, I can send it to repeater. I can use this particular API in the same way like we test for web application now. We try to intercept the request from API from the postman to the Bob suit to do other testing on it. Okay, talking about, yeah, at the starting of this particular live session, I told you about this thing called as showing a report on how does the vulnerabilities and all look like. I'll show you a report on it. What are the different vulnerabilities that we can get from here, like mass assignment leading to some privilege escalation. You can see that at this particular API register page, okay, what is happening during the assessment, we are trying to find out that some functionalities are open to everyone. The attacker can escalate the privileges. That's what we have discussed in this part of the OAuth top 10. We are able to escalate the privileges. The broken function level authorization we have discussed. Admin equals to false was there, so we made it true. Send it to repeater, and we will be able to either delete the user. So here in this particular case of here in this particular case of registering a user, you are able to delete a user. See, attacker can delete another user due to admin privileges. That's what. How do you mitigate this particular vulnerability? First, you need to use the built-in feature of blacklisting property. You can blacklist a client, or we can whitelist a client, and we need to properly give an access to different functionalities of our API. Talking about another one, excessive data exposure, that also comes in our web API, excessive data exposure. So how does it look like? So we have some get method that is used to find the endpoint, that is vi debug. Okay, and when we try to intercept that request and send it to repeater, then what happens, we get the information like this. You can see here that we are getting the user information, admin password and all. So these are the excessive information that we are getting. How do you mitigate this particular vulnerability? You try to identify and filter out the user data. You encrypt the data at rest. Another vulnerability that is there in this particular vulnerable web API is sensitive data exposure by the help of IDOR or BOLA. BOLA is the first one that we have discussed, right? The broken object level authorization. So here we are able to get an access to V1 books and users. So if you saw the screenshot, we are able to access the test book, as well as we are able to access. Now if the same user try to access the data of another input, we are still able to access it. We are getting the access of other user, other permission. So that's the vulnerability that we have got. SQL injection also we have found out. SQL injection. So you try to put a single quote, look for some kind of error messages. In this case, we got the error message something like this, and we are able to still, as it is a vulnerable machine, we are able to get the complete SQL syntax. You see here, select star from user where username equals to test1. In a secure API, we will not get this type of output of errors. This type of error output we will not get, but yeah, we will get some kind of output if we add some kind of single quote. And by if there is a skill injection vulnerability, we can use SQL map to find the at the endpoints to retrieve more information. So here you can see that we have used SQL injection or SQL map on this particular API at this particular endpoint, and we are trying to retrieve the tables here. Successful did we retrieve? We are able to retrieve the books and user. And what is the mitigation of it? What do you recommend to the client? We recommend to properly validate the input, and if there is any error message, properly handle the error. Okay, prevent unintended data based query by limiting the database procedure and code, and to deploy a particular web application firewall for filtering out the malicious input. We have rate limiting vulnerability also, like after 5-6 attempt you should be logged out, but after 18th attempt also we are able to log in. We are able to get an authorized access. This leads to security breaches. And talking about the mitigation part of it, how do you mitigate this particular vulnerability? You use time-based lockout policy or unlock policy, manual administration unlock you can do, and defined and enforce maximum size of data for all the for all we say incoming package or incoming parameters and payload, such as maximum length, maximum number of elements in an array, web APIs on APIs. Okay, so what all tools did we use for this particular case? We used Postman. Where we are able to intercept the traffic. Here, I'll turn off the intercept. We are able to log into a certificate error. We need to install the certificate for it. Okay. And apart from using Postman and Burpsuit, you will be using testing. For that, you use Kali and get an access to it. So, talking about talking about the best practices, as we have already discussed the best practices here. The best practices. Yeah. So these are the best practices from the OAups top 10. Not only OAups we have NIST framework also to test APIs, but most of the security professional, they follow this OAup web API testing guide, as well as for web application also we follow the OAups only. And what are the best practices and recommendation? First one is the security policies, API security policies you properly implement, that covers authentication, that covers authorization part, input validation, and encryption part. You can implement the principle of least privileges. If you are getting an access to an API, you should be getting an access with the lowest possible resources and functionalities. You properly audit and update your API in consider to the latest security issues. You try to develop and educate the development and operational team to develop a secure API design and deployment process. And at last, you can take the help of automated security testing tools. Maybe you can use OAups, maybe you can use ZAP for it, maybe you can use Bobsuit for it. Not everyone will be having Bobsuit Pro. So I would recommend you to go to the OAups ZAP, configure it, go back to the settings, go to proxies, and you will be able to do automated testing without paying for money. Okay, so this was the total concepts of web APIs, the RESTful API, where we discussed about HTTP verbs like get, post, update, delete, and all. Okay, that leads to CRUD also, that is used to create, read, update, and delete. The CRUD method also we say. After that, we discussed something about the API and its security issues. What are the common issues we discussed? After that, we discussed about this particular thing of the OAups top 10 API security risks, the top 10 risks, and what are the the risk exposure, what can it leads to. That all things we try to understand, and what are the prevention mechanism for all the API. The most important is the BOLA one. Okay, what is this? Broken object level authorization. You tried this could lead to data loss, disclosure, and data manipulation. So we have discussed the prevention of all the top 10 security risks. And at last, we try to see how do you capture request by the help of Postman and Bobsuit. This one is a vulnerable web API. we try to intercept by the help of burp suite. You can go to option field. You have to set this particular local host and port number to it. After intercepting the request, what else can you do it? You can, yeah, you can do a vulnerability assessment on it. Like you can do an active or passive scan on it, depending upon what your requirement is. Fine. So this is all about today's live session on APIs, and hope we'll see you with more interesting topics in the next live session. So that's it. Thank you.